On this episode of What's Going On with Shipping, things have gone nuclear down under. Hi, I'm your host, Sal Mercogliano. Okay, we're going to talk about something completely different than we normally do. This is a YouTube channel that talks about global shipping. So why am I talking about the Royal Australian Navy getting nuclear submarines? First off, hats off to a buddy of mine, H.I. Sutton, who at Covert Shores posted this image of the Royal Australian Navy's next submarine. If you don't get it, it's upside down because of being down in Australia. I know. This is actually an Astute class submarine. It is a British submarine. And the announcement that came out was that the United States and Great Britain, in conjunction with Australia, are working to provide Australia with nuclear submarines. Now, previous to this, they were under contract with the French to provide what were diesel electric submarines, Barracuda class, SSKs. Australia has conventional submarines. They do not have nuclear submarines. And so getting nuclear submarines is a massive deal for the Australians. Countries have been very protective of their nuclear technology. And understand, this is not nuclear weapons. This is nuclear power. Nuclear powered submarines, basically the only limitation on a nuclear powered submarine is the amount of food they can carry on board. Once they go under, their plants allow them to operate absolutely almost unlimited. I mean, the refueling of nuclear submarines we're talking decades until they need to be refueled. And understand, a nuclear power plant, for all its bells and whistles, is nothing more than a steam plant. Basically, what you're doing is you're having a nuclear reaction. It's heating up water, and that steam from the water is turning a turbine. Now, diesel electric submarines are much quieter. They're much quieter. Go from a Prius or a Tesla to a Ford F-150. There's a difference in sound. There's a remarkable difference in sound. Now, a nuclear submarine is not as loud as a Ford F-150 by any means, but there is an increase in sound. But the question is why? Why is Australia getting nuclear submarines? Because again, nuclear submarines are not something that's easily shared. The U.S. and Britain have had a long relationship in nuclear submarines. When the U.S. created its first nuclear submarine, Nautilus, it helped the British develop theirs. We saw it with the development of the Polaris missiles, which were the SSBNs, the ballistic missile submarines. But even then, each nation husbands their submarines very close to them. And so we don't know the details of this yet. We don't know if Australia is going to be getting Virginia class nuclear submarines, Astute class nuclear submarines, if they're getting an Astute with a Virginia sensors on board. We just don't know. All that's going to be worked out. But what this video is going to talk about today is not the details of this. This is the U.S. Naval Institute report on this. USNI News is a great source for all naval news. I've highlighted a lot of commercial sites for you, but I like USNI for the military side. This issue of a nuclear submarine for Australia becomes very important when one looks at this global trade. This is our buddies at Marine Traffic and Global Trade. And this is a live image right now of ships moving through the world. And I'm going to change this from, let's take our ship filter off. There we go. And let's go to a density map here. So you can see where basically submarines travel, or excuse me, where commercial traffic goes. So here's Australia way down here at the bottom. And you can see right around Australia, the amount of traffic that goes around it. Australia is basically the size of the United States, but an island, a continent. Yet it has only 30 million people on board. Yet it's astride some major shipping lanes. And right now, Australia and China are in the midst of a huge trade issue. There's a trade war going on between them. Australia and China have not been getting along. China imports massive amounts of ore, grain, meat, you name it, from Australia. And they've been boycotting Australia because of issues with the Australians regarding COVID. Basically, what China has begun to do is look out for alternative sources for its raw materials. Right now, it's exporting huge amounts of food out of the United States, both grains and meat. It's going to Argentina and Brazil for agricultural elements, although it's getting difficult to get it out of Argentina and the Rio de la Plata right now because of low water levels there. They're going to Africa for ores and minerals. But one of the things that Australia was really concerned about was replacing their old class of conventional submarines. And conventional submarines are great. They really are. They're quiet. They're holes in the water. They're diesel electric. They don't make a lot of noise. The problem is they have limited range and limited time on station. So this map right here was posted with the ranges and days on station that a nuclear submarine versus a conventional submarine. So if you look at the bottom here, an SSK, which is a conventional submarine, this is a diesel electric, a hybrid, has 50 days in endurance and at 6.5 knots speed of advance. So this tells you the amount of days they can be on station. Then an SSN has 90 days endurance. Again, it's largely food, but with a 20 knot speed of advance for the SSNs. Remember, diesel electrics are running off their batteries. So they, excuse me, they have lithium batteries. So they can run those batteries till they're dead, but they will not basically, they would have to be recharged, which means running the diesel means servicing the submarines. Nuclear submarines, once they go under the water, never have to come up again, really. And one of the things you see right there are these distances to key maritime choke points: Torres Strait, the Lombok Strait, the Lombok Strait, the Sunda Strait, the Straits of Malacca, the South China Sea, and right up here between Taiwan, Okinawa, and Japan. You can see right here how the distances are. Almost 4,000 miles to get off Okinawa. SSKs would have no days on station, whereas an SSN would have 73 days. But these are the ones right here that I think are really important. The one, the Torres Strait, the Lombok Strait, the Sunda Strait, and the Strait of Malacca. Those are really the ones. You can see how long SSNs can stay on station, anywhere from 78 to 84 days. So a huge amount of time they can stay at station. And if you look right here, let's zoom in here on this region right here where we're talking about, they'd be coming out of here out of roughly Perth and Fremantle. And here where we're talking about this huge, massive blood red right here, this is the Malacca Strait. These are all the ships coming out of Malacca. These are the ships heading for the Red Sea and the Suez. These are the ships heading for the Cape. These are coming out of the Sunda Strait, heading to the west coast of Australia, and then heading for the Cape route. This is Lombok Strait, again, heading toward the western side of Australia and also for the Cape route, and the Torres Strait right here, heading for northern Australia and through the narrow passage here into the Coral Sea. These are all major throughputs, major highways for shipping, particularly for China. China draws a lot of its resources across those shipping lanes, and it exports most of its goods. The issue that China has today, a lot of people want to look at China today and see it as the Soviet Union 2.0. It's communism versus capitalism. Well, let me be clear. China is not communist. I mean, they're a state-controlled government, yes, but they are a capitalist nation. They're making profits. They're making money. That's their big goal. And the thing that China is most worried about is what happened to them in World War II and what happened to the Japanese in World War II. So let's talk about that for a second. So this is a map from the West Point, from the U.S. Military Academy, the Department of History. They have a cartography section. I taught there for a year, so I love the maps that come out of here. And this is a map that they use. I'll zoom out here a little bit so I can show you the full map here. This is the Far East and the Pacific, talking about major Japanese war objectives and planned opening attacks. And one of the things I think that gets lost in World War II, especially World War II in the Pacific, is we focus on the big battles. We focus on Pearl Harbor, Midway, Coral Sea, Philippine Sea, Leyte Gulf, Guadalcanal, Coral. I mean, we focus on all the big battles, but what we tend to forget is what that war was all about. Japan found itself in a very dire strait. They had invaded China in 1937. You can make the argument they did in 31, but let's just go with the conventional idea. They invade China in 1937. Occupy all the ports, cut China off from the outside world. They then invade French Indochina in 1940. This is after France has fallen to the Nazis. This then provokes action by the United States, Great Britain, and the Dutch government in exile to cut off trade with Japan, to embargo Japan, to not export steel, not give them oil, and to freeze their bank accounts. And this economically cripples Japan. Understand, Japan gets 95% of its oil in these imports, and now all of a sudden it's cut off. I can't imagine if we had 5% of the U.S. oil cut off, how we react to that. If Canada or Mexico basically cut off our oil tomorrow, we'd be blitzkrieging our way to Mexico City and Ottawa, I'm pretty sure. But the Japanese find themselves cut off. And what they start looking to is that source of oil down here, which is the Dutch and British East Indies. there's a source right here, what they call the Southern Resource Area. And that Southern Resource Area is key for the Japanese. The whole point of the war was to gather their natural resources to make them independent of the British, the Americans, the Dutch, the French, the Australians, and secure their natural resources. And to the Japanese, I have to say this, they didn't see this as a big issue. It's colonized by the Dutch, the British, and the French. Their opinion is, well, if the British and Dutch and French can do it, why can't we do it? We'll just take it from them. And that was their objective. They were going to go in, take those natural resources to fuel their economy, complete their isolation of China, and basically get themselves what the Germans call Lebensraum, living space to live. They already done it with Korea. They've done it with Taiwan. They've done it with Manchuria, and then they're doing it with China. So their goal is to come here. However, the Japanese realize that there's a problem. They could have defeated the British, defeated the French, defeated the Dutch with no problem and taken the Dutch East Indies. The problem they had is their entire supply line would have sailed right here past the Philippines, either to the west of it through the South China Sea or to the east of it through the Western Pacific. And the problem was the United States controlled the Philippines, they controlled Guam, they controlled Wake Island, and any passage around here would have put them within air range of American bases at Guam or the Philippines. And as America cut off the oil supply to Japan, they also reinforced the Pacific Islands. One of the things they did in the Philippines is they started stationing B-17s, these flying fortresses, these big, huge 4-engine bombers that can range out a long distance. And most importantly, the U.S. had one of the largest overseas bases for submarines. The Submarine Squadron 20 was based there on 3 submarine tenders, the Holland, the Canopus, the Otis, the rescue vessel Pigeon, and then five divisions of submarines. 4 of them made up of some of the newest submarines in the U.S. Navy. And those submarines were designed to range out from Manila Bay, from the base at Cavite, and attack shipping out here in the South China Sea and the Western Pacific. That could have strangled the Japanese as equally as not taking those areas. And so the Japanese saw no other course than to go to war against the United States for fear that if they grabbed the Dutch East Indies, the British East Indies, the Americans will bottle them up. And because they didn't want to attack the Philippines directly, the biggest threat to them was the forward American base at Pearl Harbor with the U.S. Pacific Fleet, hence the attack on Pearl Harbor. Now, the Japanese went in and effectively forced the Americans to abandon their base in the Philippines. This is the naval base at Cavite. One of the major targets you see the Japanese do after the attack on Pearl Harbor is they attack the American airfields. Clark Base, Air Base is destroyed. And then on December 10th, they target the main American naval base at Cavite, which means the squadrons of American submarines have to leave. They basically have to relocate. And what they do is they relocate to Western Australia. And that brings us back over to here, to this image right here. During World War II, American submarines at a Fremantle penetrated the Dutch, what was called the Dutch barrier here, the East India barrier, and got in here to attack shipping all the time. The Fremantle submarines were some of the most effective submarines in the U.S. Pacific Fleet. Also suffered some of the most casualties, but they were extremely effective. They were able to get into the South China Sea, into the Dutch East Indies, into the Western Pacific, and attack. And especially in these little narrow choke points between Luzon and Taiwan, through the shipping here, across the parcels and all the island bases the Chinese have now fortified, they're able to get in there and interdict supplies. This is the fear that the Chinese have more than anything else. American nuclear subs, which we have a lot of, the Virginia class in particularly, are a massive threat to China because, again, one of the things that these submarines can do is interdict trade and supply. They have torpedoes. They have the ability to start sinking Chinese vessels. And that means that they can effectively cut off the movement of goods, raw materials coming in, exports heading out. China does not want to go toe-to-toe with the U.S. Navy. It's a crazy move for them to do it. There's no reason to do that. The Americans are too big. However, a country like Australia, which is much smaller and could conceivably operate independent of the United States, that they could get involved in a conflict with China that doesn't involve, again, a lot of allies. What alternatives does Australia have to exert pressure on the Chinese? Right now, the Chinese seem to be exerting the pressure on Australia. They're not taking Australian goods. They are seeking secondary sources. They are developing out here in areas. Let me get rid of the density map here because this does get a little bit clouded. There we go. The Chinese are operating out here in the Southern Pacific, establishing bases. So they're looking for alternative supply routes. Should the South China Sea be denied to them, the Straits of Malacca denied to them, then conceivably they can come around the east side of Australia, head around the southern coast of Australia, head for the Cape route. They can head for the Panama Canal, or they can try the Drake Passage, southern tip here of South America. Although I will say that's a very dangerous passage. They just had a VLCC went through there and 2 crew members were killed because of the rough seas. But nuclear submarines, should the Australians obtain 8 nuclear submarines, whether they're Astutes or Virginias, doesn't really matter. But they could deploy them and monitor these key choke points coming out. They can do the Straits of Malacca. They can be south here of Sri Lanka. They could be the entrance to the Red Sea. They could be here in the mid-Indian Ocean around Mauritius, where the Cape route goes. And again, China will not be able to really field naval forces. This is one of the things that the Chinese are developing large naval forces, but they haven't fielded large elements of them. They have operated squadrons off the east coast of Somalia, of Africa here on anti-piracy. They have a base here at Djibouti. Right now, it's their only overseas base. But they really don't have a large presence out there. Australian nuclear submarines could be a element that Australia uses in it. Now, do we think Australian nuclear submarines are going to be shooting torpedoes, sinking Chinese ships? No, probably not. But again, what this does is gives Australia the legitimacy and the clout to negotiate with China, because there's always that option. And I think one of the big things was how this announcement was made. It was meant to be loud, it was meant to be public, and it was meant to really convey to the Chinese that, hey, your trade routes may be in danger because we're going to put nuclear submarines on patrol there. And now you're going to have to treat Australia with a little bit more pause and hesitancy than perhaps you're doing right now. And I think that's one of the reasons. And again, I go back to the World War II analogy. Japan, one of the reasons that Japan surrendered in September of 1945 isn't because we dropped nuclear bombs on Hiroshima and Nagasaki. That's only a part of the element there. Japan was surrounded. We'd mined their waters. We'd cut them off with the obtaining of Okinawa. We'd cut all their supply lines off when we landed in the Philippines in October of 1944. We ranged out there. Japan was starving. It was running out of food, running out of fuel. Add to it, the Soviets come barreling through Manchuria and Korea. U.S. forces were literally steaming off the coast, bombarding planes overhead. The Japanese realized that they were strangled. That was actually the name of the operation that was undertaken, Operation Strangulation. They were strangled out. China knows that. They are cognizant of that. And China's biggest fears, I would argue, is not the United States. It's small players that can come in here and interdict these key routes. Vietnam, the Philippines, Singapore. Man, Singapore drives them crazy. Singapore is a nation that has a huge amount of clout over China because of its geolocation. Just look at the amount of traffic that comes in there. Let's go here. Let's look at ship types there. Let's put ships in there. I mean, just, one look at Singapore gives you the density right here that we're talking about here. And you come to realize why these places are so strategically important. So, I mean, you just start to see here the amount of vessels. And this is why Singapore plays such a huge role here. Come down here, Sunda Straits, same thing down here. You see a lot of traffic coming in the Sunda Straits. Lombok Straits right over here. You can see that right over here. Torres, you see the same thing. All these areas here operate with these types of traffic. And again, small players now can exert a lot of pressure. Australia, a country with 30 million people, can exert pressure against China, a country with 1.3 million, by planting nuclear submarines here and tagging vessels as they're coming in and out. And again, it gives Australia a lot of power over China to be able to negotiate with them. Because again, China is visibly constrained by these issues. That's why we see China developing so many alternative routes. The Arctic route up here into the Arctic Sea is a big one for them to want to develop. And so I think, historically speaking, even though this is a topic that we don't tend to delve into on what's going on with shipping, you can see how naval forces can play a role in commercial shipping. So I hope you enjoyed this episode. I really wanted to talk about this. I was really fascinated by the story. If you want to follow more stories about this deal, again, USNI News, the United States Naval Institute, does a great job of following this story and looking at it. They have a great staff over there: John Grady, Sam Legrone, just a great group of reporters over there. On the military naval side, I enjoy their work immensely. So hope you enjoyed the episode. If you did, please subscribe, hit the bell so you'll be alerted about new videos when they come up. Also, be sure to share it across social media. Give it a thumbs up. And hopefully when the new Royal Australian Navy comes up, they're not going to do this issue of the submarine being upside down. Sorry, Australians. This is just, I've seen this everywhere, and I know it's a terrible joke, but it's the one that I've seen. It's made me chuckle every time I looked at it. So until our next episode, this is Sal signing off.